What if the monarchy's most carefully guarded secret wasn't a scandal of money, power, or politics, but words? Words scribbled on a page, in a diary tucked away in gilded drawers, written by the woman who stood at Diana's grave as though she'd triumphed over history. Imagine for a moment those words slipping into the hands of the public. Not a rumor, not speculation. Actual lines, ink on paper. And imagine the lines didn't whisper regret. They dripped with cold calculation. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. She had to go. That's the phrase that set Britain on fire. That's the entry that turned decades of uneasy tolerance into pure outrage. And that's the sentence that forced the King of England to make the most devastating decision of his reign. Now pause here. Ask yourself this. If your spouse's secret diary suddenly spilled into the world, filled with venom about the woman your nation still reveres as a saint, could you stand by them? Or would you, like King Charles, reach the breaking point? This is not just another royal scandal. It's not a tabloid hiccup. This is a story about betrayal, ghosts that never rest, and a monarchy's survival hanging on the edge of one woman's careless words. Because make no mistake, Princess Diana may have been gone for nearly 3 decades, but her shadow is long, her memory is fierce, and her defenders never forgave the woman who took her place. The leak did not come with ceremony. No carefully curated Netflix documentary. No sanctioned interview with polished lighting. It arrived like a dagger in the night, an anonymous file drop, a leak straight to journalists who didn't hesitate to print the most damning excerpts. And once the words were out, there was no taking them back. Let's rewind for a second. Britain in 2025 is a very different place than the one Diana left behind in 1997. Social media now amplifies every whisper into a roar. News cycles turn private moments into public judgment within minutes. One comment can spark movements. One leak can spark revolutions. And in a nation where Diana is not just remembered but canonized, Camilla's private diary was a ticking bomb waiting for ignition. The very first entry that surfaced was cruel enough. It described Diana not as a victim, not as a troubled princess struggling under the weight of the crown, but as an obstacle, a problem to be removed. A woman who, in Camilla's words, wouldn't last. Wouldn't last? Do you see why Britain exploded? Do you understand why Diana's sons, now grown men with children of their own, couldn't stay silent? The diary transformed every conspiracy theory, every whispered suspicion, into fuel for fury. Think about the irony. For decades, Charles fought to rehabilitate Camilla's image. She went from mistress to wife, from wife to queen consort. Against all odds, she walked down Westminster Abbey crowned beside Charles, a woman once despised, now reluctantly accepted. And yet, a few pages of ink ripped all of that apart overnight. And here's the question no one in the palace wants to answer. Was this leak truly accidental? Diaries don't just walk out of locked drawers. Personal journals don't simply slip past royal security. Someone wanted this to be seen. Someone wanted Camilla to fall. And someone, perhaps, wanted Charles to face a choice he could no longer avoid. That choice, whether to protect his wife or to protect the crown. Now, let's not pretend the world hasn't seen royal scandals before. Edward VIII abdicated for Wallis Simpson. Princess Margaret's love life nearly fractured the monarchy in the 1960s. Even Diana's own Panorama interview in 1995 set Buckingham Palace on fire. But none of those moments carried the eerie weight of this. Why? Because this wasn't an outsider bringing shame. This wasn't a journalist catching someone off guard. This was Camilla, in her own words, seemingly admitting that Diana's downfall was inevitable, maybe even planned. And when that became public, the monarchy found itself staring down its worst nightmare. The nation comparing Charles's second wife to the woman who is still called the People's Princess. Picture the reaction. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace. Protesters holding signs with Diana's face. Hashtags demanding Camilla's resignation trending worldwide. Television pundits replaying grainy clips of Diana in her prime, juxtaposed against the cold lines from Camilla's diary. It wasn't just anger, it was grief reopened. It was betrayal relived. And in the middle of this storm stood King Charles, a man who had waited his entire life to be king, now faced with a decision that would define his reign. Does he stand by the woman he loved long before Diana ever entered his life? Or does he listen to his advisors, his people, and most painfully, his son William, who allegedly told him, "She's done enough damage, father. It's time." The tragedy here is layered. Imagine Charles in private, torn between loyalty and survival. Imagine William, haunted by his mother's death, now watching the woman he always blamed for it all write words that seemed to confirm his darkest suspicions. And imagine the British public, who had never truly forgiven Camilla, finally seeing what they always believed in black and white. But here's the twist. This diary may not just be scandalous, it may be dangerous. Some entries, according to those who've seen them, don't just mock Diana. They hint at knowledge. Knowledge about her fate. Knowledge about the night in Paris. Hints so chilling that even hardened royal journalists admitted they'd never seen anything like it. And that's where this story goes from shocking to seismic. Because if even a fraction of these entries are true, then Camilla is not just a queen consort with a sharp pen and a cruel streak. She becomes something else entirely in the eyes of the public, a villain in Diana's tragedy. So where does this leave us? A king torn between heart and throne. A queen consort stripped bare by her own hand. A nation reliving its greatest wound. And a ghost, Diana's ghost, hovering over it all, more powerful in death than she ever was in life. But let me leave you with this before we move deeper into the chaos. The very first diary entry wasn't the worst. No, the cruel remark about Diana not lasting was only the beginning. Because buried deeper inside, in handwriting only Camilla's could produce, was a line that would stop Charles in his tracks and push William into a rage so powerful he demanded action. And when you hear that line, you'll understand why the King of England filed for divorce. It began quietly. No royal press release. No carefully staged announcement. Just a single email dropped into the inbox of a mid-level journalist at a London tabloid. Attached, a scanned image of aged, yellowed paper. Handwriting across the page. Looping, sharp, unmistakably feminine. And at the top, the date. April 1996. Think about that for a second. April 1996. Diana was alive, but the marriage was already in ruins. Divorce proceedings had started. Camilla was still the other woman, hiding in shadows while the world mourned the collapse of the fairy tale. And in the middle of that storm, Camilla allegedly wrote in her private diary words that would set Britain ablaze nearly 3 decades later. The journalist who opened that email didn't believe it at first. Diaries don't leak. Royal documents don't just appear. This had to be a prank, some elaborate hoax. But the handwriting? It matched. The references inside. Specific, intimate, things only someone within the royal circle would know. And one line, underlined twice as though it mattered more than anything, froze him. I always knew Diana wouldn't last. She had to go. Imagine being the first outsider to read that. Would you dismiss it? Or would you, like this journalist, feel the weight of history suddenly pressing on your chest? He forwarded it up the chain. Editors gasped. Lawyers argued. Should they publish? Could they even dare? And by dawn, the decision was made. Britain would wake up to Camilla's words splashed across the front page. When the story broke, it wasn't just news. It was detonation. Newspapers sold out before noon. Social media lit up like wildfire. Radio call-in shows buzzed with fury. The BBC ran urgent panels debating authenticity, but the damage was done. In living rooms across Britain, Diana's face appeared on TV screens again, not as a distant memory, but as a haunting presence pulled back into the spotlight. For millions, that one line was all the proof they ever needed. For years, conspiracy theorists whispered that Diana's death wasn't an accident. That forces wanted her gone because she was too popular, too uncontrollable, too powerful. And now, here was Camilla, the woman most despised in Diana's story, allegedly writing that very sentiment years before the Paris crash. Can you imagine the fury? Outside Kensington Palace, mourners once again laid flowers as though Diana had just died yesterday. Messages written on cards were angrier this time. Some read, "Justice for Diana." Others, "We never forgot." And the harshest of all, Camilla knew. Inside Buckingham Palace, panic reigned. Staff scrambled, phones rang without pause. Advisors huddled in locked rooms. One insider later said the atmosphere felt like a second Diana funeral. The monarchy, barely steady after years of rebuilding, was on the brink of implosion again. But here's where it gets even stranger. That first leak was only one page. Just one. And yet it felt like the opening of Pandora's box. If one page had slipped, how many more existed? What else had Camilla written? And more importantly, who leaked it? Theories swirled instantly. Was it a palace aide with access to Camilla's personal things? A disloyal staffer? A hacker who stumbled onto digital scans? Or, and here's the twist, was it someone much closer to the royal family? Someone who wanted to expose Camilla once and for all? The palace tried to clamp down fast. Fabricated, they called it. An obvious forgery. But the problem was, handwriting experts disagreed. Some claimed the loops and slants matched Camilla's authenticated letters perfectly. Others pointed out subtle inconsistencies, suggesting it might have been altered. But by then, the truth didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was already in. Camilla had written it. And the anger wasn't just public. It was personal. Prince William, stoic and disciplined for years, reportedly confronted his father within hours of the story breaking. His words, according to leaks, were cutting. "She's done enough damage, father. It's time." But we'll get to William's fury later. For now, let's sit in the chaos of those first 48 hours. Picture it. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting outside Clarence's house, crowds chanting Diana's name. Some even demanded Camilla step down as queen consort immediately. Online petitions gathered millions of signatures overnight. And in pubs across Britain, ordinary people debated not whether the diary was real, but whether Camilla had finally revealed the truth about Diana's death. The media dug deeper, replaying archival footage of Diana's interviews. Her haunting panorama line, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," was replayed endlessly, now cast in a new, sinister light. Documentaries resurfaced, analyzing her final days in Paris. Every tragic image, Diana fleeing paparazzi, Diana lying in hospital, was revisited with fresh pain, now viewed through the lens of Camilla's alleged words. And that's when the true horror struck. People began to wonder what had to go really meant. Was Camilla simply being spiteful, predicting Diana's marriage wouldn't last? Or was she implying something much darker? Ask yourself. If you found your partner's diary and read those words about someone who later died tragically, what would you think? Could you ever erase the suspicion? This is why the fury was unstoppable. Because even if Camilla had meant the phrase innocently, the timing, the context, the history made it unbearable. For Diana's supporters, it sounded like confirmation. For Charles, it sounded like a death sentence. Not for his wife, but for his reign. And let's not forget the symbolism. Camilla had clawed her way from despised mistress to crowned queen consort. Every public appearance beside Charles was proof that she'd outlasted the scandal. And yet, one page of her own handwriting stripped her of everything she'd built. But here's where the story takes its first sharp twist. Because just when the palace thought it could survive by dismissing one page as fake, another diary entry leaked. This one wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was chilling. And it suggested Camilla knew far more about Diana's fate than anyone dared imagine. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It began with 6 words. Short, sharp, devastating. "I always knew Diana wouldn't last. She had to go." Imagine reading that in the quiet of a morning, coffee in hand, thinking it could only be another mundane royal anecdote, and then feeling the ground shift beneath your feet. Those words, allegedly Camilla's, were not just mean-spirited. They were explosive, seismic, a whispered accusation that seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions about Diana's tragic life. Ask yourself, if someone wrote that about a woman you loved, someone whose memory is sacred to millions, could you stay silent? For millions of Britons, the answer was a resounding no. Social media lit up, hashtags spread like wildfire, and newspapers ran front-page splashes with the words alone. Even in the world of royal coverage, where whispers and innuendos abound, this was different. This was explicit. This was personal. The nation reacted in stages. First came disbelief. "Surely this is a forgery," people murmured. Handwriting analysts were quickly called in, and yes, some differences existed, tiny variations in the loops and slants. But most experts agreed. The words were authentic, penned by Camilla herself. And that's when the disbelief turned to outrage. Imagine the emotion surging in living rooms across England. Families gathered around their televisions, some clutching Diana memorabilia. The outcry wasn't only for nostalgia's sake, it was visceral. Diana's legacy was under attack again. The woman who had given so much, who had become a symbol of grace under pressure, was now being vilified posthumously by her supposed rival. And the revelation that Camilla might have had darker knowledge only fanned the flames. Then came the emotional spike, the personal side of the story. Prince William, now a man in his early 40s, was reportedly furious. He had lived his life under the shadow of loss, under the weight of constant public scrutiny, and now, decades later, he was confronted with words from the very woman many believed had overshadowed his mother. According to leaks, his message to his father was blunt. "She's done enough damage, father. It's time." Let that sink in. William, once a boy shielding his grief, was now an adult demanding accountability. He wasn't just angry for himself. He was angry for Diana, for the nation, and perhaps for the children of the future who would inherit the crown. In that moment, the diary wasn't just a scandal. It became a moral reckoning. Meanwhile, the media frenzy intensified. Every interview with Camilla, every public appearance, was now scrutinized for signs of guilt, for flickers of emotion, for anything that might confirm the diary's authenticity. Analysts pored over video clips of Diana, contrasting her grace and warmth with Camilla's alleged cold-blooded writing. The public drew connections, whether real or imagined, and soon, the phrase "she had to go" became a meme, a rallying cry, a symbol of betrayal. But the story didn't stay at the surface of media outrage. Behind closed doors, the palace was in crisis mode. Advisors reportedly scrambled to manage the fallout. Security protocols were tightened. Internal investigations began into how such a personal document could escape. The diary's leak raised uncomfortable questions. Was this an act of sabotage? A deliberate attempt to manipulate the king? Or something even darker, a hint at truths long buried? And that's when the narrative took a darker turn. Because the diary didn't just describe Diana as fragile or fleeting. In some passages, allegedly, Camilla hinted that Diana's end was inevitable, almost preordained. Those passages, vague yet terrifying, suggested foreknowledge, a foresight that no ordinary grudge could explain. People began to ask questions out loud that had previously existed only in whispers. Did Camilla know something about Diana's fate? Did she, in some way, play a part in the tragedies that followed? The tension was palpable. Public anger collided with private grief. Media coverage became relentless. Headlines screamed, "Camilla's secret diary reveals cruel thoughts about Diana," and the words that shocked a nation. Social media platforms were ablaze with debate, speculation, and outrage. Experts on royal history, psychology, and ethics weighed in endlessly, dissecting every nuance of the diary, analyzing motives, and debating consequences. And yet, amidst the public spectacle, there was a quieter, more intimate fallout. Charles, the king, was reportedly in turmoil. His advisors pressed him to act, to distance himself from his wife, to consider the crown above all else. He faced a terrible choice: loyalty to the woman he had loved for decades, or loyalty to the monarchy, to the people, to history. The diary had forced his hand, turning private sentiment into public crisis. Meanwhile, speculation about the diary's origins added another layer of suspense. Who leaked it? Was it a palisade with personal grievances? A journalist seeking notoriety? Or perhaps even William himself, ensuring that his father faced the truth? Every theory seemed plausible, and none could be confirmed. The uncertainty only fueled the fire. Public protests erupted. Outside Buckingham Palace and Clarence House, people carried photos of Diana, flowers, candles, and banners denouncing Camilla. The nation was reeling. Social commentators compared the scene to Diana's funeral in 1997, a mixture of grief, anger, and collective memory. Some even suggested parallels to historical coups, moments when private words had shifted the trajectory of power. And amidst all this, the diary itself became a character in the drama. Each page revealed layers of intention, cruelty, and ambition. For some, it was a confession. For others, it was proof of the treacherous nature of human ambition. But one thing was certain: it changed the story. Forever. And yet, despite the intensity, the most chilling revelation was still to come. Because if the public thought they had seen the worst in that six-word phrase, They had no idea what lay in the following entries. Hints, suggestions, shadows of a truth so dark that even the king himself would struggle to confront it. And that is where we leave the diary for now. Dangling, dangerous, a ticking bomb in the hands of history. But what came next, the very next revelation, would not only shock the nation. It would push the monarchy to a breaking point, one from which there would be no return. It was one thing to hear the words splashed across newspapers, social media, and television screens. It was another entirely to have them whispered in your ear by someone you trusted, someone who carried the weight of history on his shoulders. That someone was Prince William. William had grown up in the shadow of tragedy, his mother's death shaping his adolescence with relentless intensity. Every birthday, every family event, every public appearance reminded him of what he had lost and who he had lost it to. And now, decades later, he was confronted with a reality more shocking than any tabloid headline. The woman who had stood by his father's side, who had clawed her way to public acceptance, had allegedly written in her private diary that Diana had to go. Ask yourself, what would you do in that moment? How could you remain silent? For William, silence was not an option. Not now. Not ever. Reports suggest that within hours of the leak, William requested a private meeting with his father. Charles, ever the diplomat in public, the steady monarch behind palace walls, found himself facing a son who was furious, articulate, and unrelenting. "She's done enough damage, father. It's time," William allegedly said, each word striking like a hammer, forcing Charles to confront not just public outrage but familial pressure of the most personal kind. The room, according to insiders, was tense beyond description. The king, faced with the convergence of history, public opinion, and his own son's moral authority, had to make a decision that would define his reign. Every instinct told him to protect his wife, to defend Camilla from the fury of millions. But every ounce of reason, every whisper of legacy, demanded accountability. William's voice reportedly did not waver. He reminded his father of Diana's legacy, of the public's enduring grief, and of the fragile trust the monarchy still maintained with its subjects. "History will remember this, father, and not kindly," he is said to have added, eyes blazing with the intensity of someone who had carried grief for too long, who had witnessed betrayal firsthand, and who would no longer tolerate injustice. At the same time, William's words were not only a rebuke, they were a plea. A plea for his father to choose the institution over the individual, to prioritize the crown over personal loyalty. And in doing so, he reminded Charles that monarchy is not just about power, but perception. That public trust, once broken, can take generations to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. Meanwhile, the king's advisors scrambled. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, some urging immediate action to distance Charles from Camilla, others cautioning against rash moves that could destabilize the monarchy entirely. Security was heightened. Internal investigations were conducted. The palace became a theater of secrecy, rumor, and strategy. And through it all, the diary loomed, a silent witness to ambition, betrayal, and the unrelenting passage of time. The public, unaware of these private meetings, speculated endlessly. Could William truly have confronted his father? Would he demand Camilla's removal? Social media and commentary shows buzzed with theories, fan theories mixed with plausible palace drama, as the nation collectively held its breath. But in the private chambers of Buckingham Palace, this was more than speculation. It was strategy, confrontation, and the palpable weight of history. Charles, who had spent his life preparing for the crown, now faced one of the most personal and painful decisions of his reign. Protect the woman he loved, or preserve the monarchy he was destined to lead. And in that room, William's ultimatum carried the gravity of both family and legacy. It is said that in those tense hours, Charles considered every scenario. Divorce would be unprecedented in modern British monarchy, shocking the nation and international observers alike. But remaining loyal to Camilla in the face of this diary, in the shadow of Diana's enduring memory, could irreparably damage the monarchy's credibility. The stakes were monumental, and every choice carried irreversible consequences. And yet, despite the tension, the moment was also one of clarity. William, embodying both grief and moral authority, had forced Charles to confront the unthinkable, that private words, written decades ago, could dictate public fate. That the monarchy's survival sometimes requires decisions that cut deeper than personal loyalty. As the conversation ended, Charles reportedly left the room in silence, weighed down by the enormity of what had just transpired. Advisors sensed that a decision was imminent. The palace braced for the storm that would follow, and beyond those walls, the nation waited, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding in the corridors of power, but instinctively sensing that something historic was about to occur. But just as the tension reached its peak, another revelation came to light, one that neither William nor Charles could have predicted. A second page from Camilla's diary had surfaced, more explicit, more chilling, and far more damning than the first. The words hinted not just at disdain, but at foreknowledge, at complicity, at a shadowed awareness of Diana's ultimate fate. And that's where the chapter ends, on the brink of revelation. What came next would force King Charles to take an action that no one outside the palace could have imagined. And it all began with those 6 words: she had to go. It didn't take long for Britain to erupt. Within hours of the diary's publication, social media was a frenzy of outrage, disbelief, and raw emotion. Twitter threads lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForDiana, #CamillaExposed, and #SheHadToGo, trending not just in London but across the globe. People who had never cared about royal gossip found themselves drawn into the maelstrom, compelled by the weight of Camilla's alleged words. On the streets, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Outside Buckingham Palace and Clarence House, crowds formed spontaneously. Signs were held high. Some reading "Camilla must go," others simply "We remember Diana." Flowers and candles were laid as if Diana herself were still alive, mourning her in absentia. Strangers consoled each other, sharing grief that wasn't theirs directly but felt profoundly personal. The nation was reliving history, and this time, the pain was rawer, more immediate, because it was fueled by words from the woman who had taken Diana's place. The media frenzy was relentless. News anchors debated the authenticity of the diary on live television. Experts in handwriting, psychology, and royal history were interviewed repeatedly. Tabloids published page after page, each claim more sensational than the last. Documentaries re-aired, emphasizing Diana's compassion, her struggles, and the circumstances that led to her death. Every clip, every photograph, every quote from Diana was now cast against Camilla's alleged betrayal. Even outside Britain, the outrage spread. International media outlets covered the story extensively. Paris newspapers revisited Diana's final days. American talk shows dissected the diary's implications. Social media users in Australia, Canada, and beyond weighed in, comparing Diana's legacy with Camilla's alleged cold-blooded commentary. The world watched as Britain grappled with the resurfacing of its most painful royal scandal. Inside the palace, the pressure was equally intense. Advisors met in emergency sessions, debating crisis strategies. Should Charles release a statement? Should Camilla address the public? How could the monarchy survive when its very foundation seemed threatened by one set of private writings? Some insiders warned that the situation had the potential to spiral into civil unrest, while others focused on public relations strategies designed to contain the outrage. But containment seemed impossible. Royal correspondents began speculating on the long-term consequences. Camilla's reputation, carefully rehabilitated over decades, was crumbling in real time. Polls suggested that a majority of Britons now viewed her with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Public opinion, which had once reluctantly accepted her as queen consort, now called for her removal. Meanwhile, the palace faced scrutiny over how such a private document could escape security protocols, prompting questions about loyalty, discretion, and potential sabotage. Amid this chaos, Diana's friends and allies spoke out. Some gave emotional interviews recalling her kindness, her courage, and her enduring legacy. Others, less restrained, openly criticized Camilla, highlighting years of rumored manipulation and intrigue. Their voices added a human element to the scandal, reinforcing the perception that the diary wasn't just a personal attack. It was an assault on Diana's memory and the values she represented. The public's emotional response was a mix of grief, anger, and betrayal. Many citizens felt a personal connection to Diana, viewing her as a moral compass in an era of uncertainty. Camilla, once tolerated reluctantly, now seemed to embody the opposite: cold calculation, ambition unchecked by conscience, and a seeming disregard for human life. The narrative had shifted dramatically. The diary, once a private venting, had become evidence, real or perceived, of a woman who had stood in the shadows, shaping history in ways that were morally questionable at best. Meanwhile, social media campaigns amplified the outrage. TikTok videos dissected each diary entry. Instagram Reels dramatized the timeline of events between Diana and Camilla. YouTube creators speculated endlessly on the implications, generating millions of views and sparking global conversations. Even memes, often the province of humor, became tools of protest, circulating images of Diana juxtaposed with Camilla, the captions dripping with irony and scorn. The intensity of public fury placed Charles in an impossible position. He was caught between defending his wife and acknowledging the undeniable public sentiment. Any statement he made risked further inflaming the situation. Silence, too, was perilous. Perceived indecision could be interpreted as complicity. Every move, every word, every gesture was scrutinized under the harsh light of history and media attention. And yet, the diary's impact went beyond immediate outrage. It rekindled debates about monarchy, morality, and accountability. Scholars and commentators revisited Diana's charitable work, her influence on social justice, and her role in modernizing the monarchy's public image. They contrasted her legacy with Camilla's alleged ambitions, creating a narrative of moral dichotomy that inflamed public opinion even further. Meanwhile, within the palace, tensions were reaching a breaking point. Advisors reportedly warned Charles that if action wasn't taken, public pressure could force a constitutional crisis. Polls suggested a decline in trust for the monarchy itself. Political leaders, often careful to avoid interfering with royal affairs, were now being questioned about the institution's stability. Every conversation, every briefing, every private meeting was tinged with urgency. The diary was no longer just a document. It was a catalyst, shaking the very foundations of power. And as public fury reached its apex, another twist emerged. Additional pages from Camilla's diary began to surface online, more explicit, more damning, hinting not only at disdain for Diana but at a knowledge of events no outsider could have known. The revelation deepened the crisis, intensifying anger, suspicion, and fear. By the end of those first furious days, Britain was no longer merely shocked. It was mobilized. Streets, social media, homes, and offices were all engaged in one question. How could the monarchy survive when its secrets were laid bare in ink? And amidst all this, the silent question lingered. What would King Charles do next? And that's where the chapter leaves us, teetering on the edge of chaos. The fury had erupted, the nation was demanding justice, and Charles faced a decision that would define not just his reign but the legacy of the crown itself. But what came next? The king's private struggle within the walls of Buckingham Palace would bring the storm to a crescendo no one could have predicted. The moment the diary went public, Buckingham Palace became a pressure cooker. Every corridor echoed with whispers. Every door seemed to hide secrets, and every aide feared the next leak could be the final one. What had once been a well-oiled institution of pomp, tradition, and secrecy now resembled a war room. Panic, strategy, and desperation collided in a way the palace had not seen since Diana's death decades earlier. At the center of it all was King Charles, a man trained to navigate crises with restraint and decorum. And yet, this was different. This was intimate. This was personal. Camilla, his wife, whose image he had spent decades rehabilitating, was now the source of a scandal that threatened to unravel everything. Advisors pleaded for calm, for strategic messaging, for careful, measured statements to the press. But Charles knew the truth. No carefully drafted press release could undo the damage caused by ink on paper. Every phone call, every confidential briefing, every late-night meeting was steeped in tension. Security protocols were tightened, not just for the royal family, but for every individual who might be implicated in the diary's leak. Analysts, PR specialists, and royal historians were consulted endlessly. Every detail of Camilla's past, her relationships with staff, her movements in the palace, all were re-examined. The palace had to understand how such a breach occurred and, more importantly, how to contain the fallout. But containment was nearly impossible. In the digital age, news travels faster than any royal statement can respond. Social media platforms became relentless amplifiers of outrage. Memes, video analyses, and editorials dissected every possible angle. The public didn't just want to read the diary, they wanted accountability. And as public anger intensified, it placed Charles in a perilous position. How could a king protect his spouse while safeguarding the monarchy's reputation? Within the palace, loyalties were tested. Some aides quietly sympathized with Camilla, believing that the diary was taken out of context or manipulated. Others, more pragmatic, understood that her words had ignited a crisis that could not be ignored. Arguments flared behind closed doors. Some courtiers pushed for a formal divorce to stabilize public opinion. Others insisted that loyalty to the queen consort was paramount. And all the while, Charles himself weighed the impossible: love, loyalty, and duty colliding in ways that demanded immediate, decisive action. One insider described the atmosphere as apocalyptic, with tension so thick it could be felt in every room. Security personnel patrolled more frequently, fearing further leaks. Staff worked in hushed tones, communicating through encrypted channels and closed-door meetings. Every decision, every move was scrutinized. The diary had transformed Buckingham Palace into a fortress, and yet the threat was internal, a poison from within, not from outside forces. Meanwhile, advisors debated the optics. Could Charles release a statement expressing regret for the diary's existence while affirming loyalty to Camilla? Should Camilla herself address the nation? Or would any public appearance worsen the crisis? Each option carried risks. Every decision had long-term consequences. The palace, usually a symbol of stability, now mirrored the chaos outside. And then there was the human element, Charles's personal struggle. A man of decades of public service, trained in diplomacy and restraint, now faced a storm with no precedent. His life with Camilla, the woman he had loved for so long, was under threat not because of public opinion alone, but because of private words that exposed ambition, resentment, and possible complicity. Every moment he spent with advisors, with William, with Camilla herself, was weighed down by the enormity of the scandal. Charles reportedly spent nights pacing, consulting a small circle of trusted confidants. Sleep was elusive. Meals were skipped. Decisions loomed like shadows over every action. And while advisors discussed strategy and optics, Charles wrestled with morality, loyalty, and legacy. Every choice had personal and public consequences, and the diary had forced him into a position no monarch wants to face. Either protect love or protect history. Meanwhile, the leak's origins remained mysterious. Investigations were ongoing. Was it a palace aide, disillusioned and vengeful? A journalist with insider access? Or someone else entirely, closer to the family than anyone could imagine? Each theory carried implications that could destroy careers, relationships, and reputations. The palace, already under pressure, found itself forced to confront not just a public relations nightmare, but the real possibility of betrayal from within. Public opinion continued to escalate. Polls suggested that the majority of Britons now believed Camilla's diary revealed something far more sinister than mere gossip. Protesters outside royal residences demanded accountability, not just for Camilla, but for the institution itself. Journalists speculated endlessly about the possibility of divorce, constitutional consequences, and the impact on the next generation of the monarchy. Every day, every hour, every minute intensified the pressure. And as the palace wrestled with containment, a second diary page surfaced. This one was darker, more explicit. References to foreknowledge and complicity in Diana's ultimate fate were allegedly made, chilling insiders to the core. Advisors reportedly informed Charles that ignoring this revelation was no longer an option. Every delay risked the monarchy's stability. Every hesitation risked history turning against him. By the end of the first week, Buckingham Palace had transformed from a seat of tradition and ceremony into a battleground of secrecy, strategy, and survival. The king, caught between loyalty and duty, was forced to consider the unthinkable: divorce. Not out of desire or whim, but as a necessary measure to preserve the crown. And yet, the diary's most shocking pages had not yet been fully analyzed, leaving Charles in suspense. A dangerous, unrelenting suspense that made every decision feel like walking on a razor's edge. But what happened next? The revelation that would make divorce not just a possibility, but an imperative, would shock the palace, the nation, and the world in ways no one could have predicted. The palace had never felt quieter, and yet the tension was deafening. King Charles paced his private chambers, the weight of history pressing down with every step. The diary's words were no longer a public controversy alone. They had become a personal trial. The phrase "she had to go" haunted him, not just as a headline or a scandal, but as a moral reckoning. Each syllable seemed to echo through Buckingham Palace, reminding him of the impossible choice before him: love or legacy. Divorce. The very word carried seismic weight in the monarchy. Not since Queen Victoria's era had such a private marital rift threatened to upend public perception on this scale. To divorce Camilla would be to acknowledge a fracture in the royal institution itself, a tacit admission that even decades of rehabilitation could not erase history, anger, and suspicion. Advisors warned that the decision could ripple through Parliament, the Commonwealth, and the hearts of millions of Britons who had reluctantly accepted Camilla as their queen consort. And yet, to do nothing would be just as perilous. The public fury, already raging, showed no signs of abating. Polls suggested that Camilla's approval rating had plummeted. Petition campaigns were gathering steam. The press, sensing blood, circulated speculative timelines and analyses, some even suggesting constitutional crises if Charles failed to act. For the first time in his reign, Charles faced an existential question. Would the monarchy survive if loyalty to a spouse superseded accountability to the crown? The legal and procedural complexities were staggering. A divorce at this level wasn't simply a matter of hiring lawyers. Royal protocol, financial settlements, public perception, and international diplomacy all intersected. Advisors prepared reports on potential fallout, financial implications for the crown, questions of succession, and the optics of a king divorcing his queen consort in the midst of scandal. Every decision had the power to define history. But beyond the legalities and public perception, the emotional stakes were suffocating. Charles had spent decades navigating a world of protocol, duty, and personal sacrifice. Camilla had been a companion, confidant, and partner in both private and public spheres. The thought of ending the marriage, regardless of scandal, brought profound personal grief. And yet, the diary's revelations made it impossible to ignore the implications. Love could no longer be disentangled from consequence. It is said that during these hours of deliberation, Charles consulted a small circle of trusted advisors, not just legal experts, but confidants who understood the human and symbolic weight of his decision. Their counsel was unanimous. Action was necessary. The monarchy could not withstand continued association with someone whose words, whether malicious or prophetic, had ignited national outrage and threatened the crown's legitimacy. At the same time, Charles faced a more intimate confrontation. Prince William, already furious over the diary's revelations, reportedly pressed his father to act swiftly. His message was blunt. Loyalty to Camilla could no longer justify ignoring the public, the institution, and history itself. "Father," he is said to have insisted, "the crown cannot survive if we do nothing. We must act now." William's ultimatum added pressure that was both personal and public, a son demanding accountability from his father at the highest stakes imaginable. Meanwhile, Camilla herself remained a figure of uncertainty. Reports suggested that she was aware of the diary's leak before it became public. Her reaction, measured but tense, reportedly oscillated between denial and defensiveness. In private, aides claimed she tried to assert her innocence, emphasizing that her words were taken out of context. But context, in the court of public opinion, mattered little. The damage was done, and the diary had shifted the narrative irrevocably. The king's inner circle debated timing, messaging, and strategy. Should the divorce be announced immediately, or should a careful plan be enacted to mitigate public outrage? How would foreign leaders react? How could the palace preserve dignity while acknowledging betrayal? Every consideration, no matter how small, had monumental consequences. And then came another complication. Additional diary pages emerged, leaked through channels that no one could trace. These entries were even more damning, suggesting a level of calculation and foreknowledge that horrified palace officials. The words were not just unkind. They hinted at an awareness of Diana's ultimate fate. Some advisors reportedly described the pages as nuclear, a force that could not be contained through conventional damage control. It was in that moment that Charles realized the inevitability of his decision. Love, history, loyalty, all collided, but the crown required clarity. The diary had forced his hand. Public outrage, family pressure, and the weight of centuries of monarchy converged into a single imperative. Camilla had to be removed from the king's life. Not for vengeance, not for spite, but to preserve the very institution he had spent decades preparing to serve. The night before the announcement, the king reportedly wrote letters to his closest allies, conferring with legal advisors, and drafting statements that balanced personal grief with public duty. Sleep was fleeting, reflection was haunting, and throughout it all, the words from the diary lingered like shadows, shaping his every thought, every decision, every emotion. By dawn, the palace had finalized the plan. Divorce proceedings would be initiated immediately. Public messaging would emphasize duty, accountability, and preservation of the monarchy. Camilla would be offered privacy, security, and discretion, but the separation would be absolute. The king's decision, though painful, was necessary. And yet, even as the plan was set in motion, the most shocking revelation was yet to unfold. Because the diary's final pages, the ones still under scrutiny, contained hints that could change everything. Secrets that might implicate others in the royal household. Secrets that, if revealed, could redefine the monarchy's history entirely. The day of the announcement dawned gray and heavy over London, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the monarchy's fracture. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors and communications teams moved with tense precision. Every word, every pause, every gesture had been rehearsed, scrutinized, and debated to ensure the message struck the delicate balance between personal grief and public duty. And yet, no rehearsal could prepare anyone, including King Charles himself, for the shock that would ripple across the nation and the globe. At exactly 10 a.m., the announcement was delivered. The king, standing in the opulent, historic setting of Buckingham Palace, addressed the public with measured composure, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. He spoke not only as a monarch, but as a man torn between love and legacy. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that no one in the room, or watching from home, could ignore. The announcement of the immediate divorce from Camilla, precipitated by the diary leak, was official. The nation reacted in waves. Across London, screens in shops, pubs, and homes lit up with the king's address. Social media exploded. Every platform was inundated with reactions, disbelief, outrage, sorrow, and speculation. Camilla must pay for her betrayal, wrote some. The crown is finally doing the right thing, typed others. Memes, videos, and hashtags multiplied at a staggering pace. The diary's words, now intertwined with the king's public decision, fueled a perfect storm of scrutiny and emotion. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered almost instantly. Protesters, mourners, and curious onlookers swelled the streets, carrying flowers, signs, and banners. Some were chanting for Camilla's removal, others were honoring Diana's memory. Police struggled to maintain order as media crews captured every moment, broadcasting live around the world. The announcement had transformed from a private palace matter into a global spectacle, a historic moment that would be analyzed for generations. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was electric with tension and apprehension. Advisors monitored public sentiment in real time, reading comments, tweets, and news reports with the intensity of analysts in a war room. Every reaction mattered, every shift in tone was recorded, and every decision going forward would be shaped by the immediacy of the public's response. The king, meanwhile, retreated to private quarters to absorb the weight of the decision. It was one thing to make a choice. It was another entirely to live with its consequences under the gaze of the world. Prince William's reaction, when finally made public, added another layer of gravity. He appeared at a carefully staged press event, flanked by a small circle of aides, and addressed the nation with a mix of firmness and emotion. "The monarchy has endured because it has always put duty above all," he said. "This decision, though painful, is necessary for the integrity of our institution. My mother's legacy and the trust of the people must never be compromised." The media immediately interpreted William's statement as a direct critique of Camilla, amplifying the tension further. Headlines blared. William condemns Camilla. The Sun demands accountability. Monarchy torn apart. Analysts dissected every word, every pause, and every nuance, speculating endlessly on whether William's influence had pressured his father into action. Meanwhile, Camilla's response, or lack thereof, became a subject of intense speculation. Some suggested she was in private mourning. Others claimed she was furious and plotting a counter-narrative. Rumors swirled that she might appeal to legal avenues or leverage palace alliances to mitigate damage. But her silence, whether strategic or emotional, only deepened the public's perception of guilt. International reaction was equally swift. World leaders, accustomed to diplomatic neutrality in royal affairs, were forced to comment delicately. European monarchies expressed sympathy for the institution, while media outlets in America, Asia, and Australia framed the event as a historic scandal, comparing it to previous royal crises but noting the unprecedented immediacy and transparency of the divorce announcement. And then came the financial implications. Rumors circulated about the crown's budget, security costs, and the logistics of separating households. Advisors projected potential losses and political ramifications, highlighting the complexity of executing a divorce at this scale. Charles, already burdened with moral and personal stakes, now faced logistical and bureaucratic hurdles that compounded the emotional weight of his decision. Despite the meticulous planning, the announcement also ignited an unanticipated cultural response. Artists, writers, and commentators began reinterpreting Diana's legacy, Camilla's role, and the broader implications for monarchy in modern society. Books and documentaries were quickly commissioned, social media threads became academic discussions, and even comedians and satirists weighed in, blending humor with social commentary in ways that made the public engagement nearly inescapable. Yet the most dangerous element remained Camilla's diary. Even after the announcement, additional pages were leaked in fragments, each one more damning than the last. Allegations of foreknowledge, strategic manipulation, and potentially dark insights into Diana's fate threatened to escalate the scandal to new heights. Advisors warned that these revelations could undermine the divorce announcement itself, raising questions about whether further action might be necessary. By nightfall, Britain had fully absorbed the shock. Television coverage was continuous, social media never paused, and the public's appetite for detail was insatiable. The announcement, meant to stabilize the monarchy, had instead ignited a firestorm. The king had acted decisively, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Camilla, once a figure carefully cultivated to represent poise, grace, and loyalty, was now under an unforgiving spotlight. The diary's leak had stripped her of every protective layer the palace and public relations teams had meticulously built over decades. In the court of public opinion, she was no longer queen consort. She was a symbol of betrayal, manipulation, and scandal. The media wasted no time. Newspapers splashed her image across front pages, often juxtaposed with Diana's smiling face, emphasizing the stark contrast between the two women. Television anchors dissected her alleged diary entries line by line, analyzing tone, context, and potential implications. Talk shows invited experts to speculate on everything from her motivations to her role in the palace's internal politics. The scrutiny was relentless, global, and merciless. Social media platforms were equally unforgiving. Twitter exploded with hashtags like #CamillaExposed, #DianaDeservedBetter, and #RoyalBetrayal, trending not just in the UK but worldwide. TikTok and Instagram Reels dramatized her alleged words, often using dramatic reenactments, voiceovers, and commentary that painted her as cunning and unfeeling. Memes spread like wildfire, reducing decades of palace diplomacy to punchy, viral ridicule. Camilla's public appearances, previously calculated to project composure, now became minefields. Photographs of her walking through gardens, entering private residences, or even leaving shops were analyzed for expressions, body language, and demeanor. Every furrowed brow or hesitation was interpreted as guilt. The palace, usually a fortress of privacy, seemed to have no defense against the relentless public gaze. Inside the palace, Camilla's aides scrambled to manage the fallout. Crisis management teams worked around the clock, drafting statements, planning potential interviews, and coordinating security measures. Her team emphasized context, attempting to frame the diary as private venting or misinterpreted commentary. But no statement, no carefully crafted message, could counteract the overwhelming tide of public anger. Every explanation seemed insufficient. Every word risked further scrutiny. The emotional toll on Camilla was profound. Insiders described her as a mix of defiance, anxiety, and isolation. She reportedly spent hours in private reflection, grappling with the consequences of her words now made public. Family, friends, and close confidants were called upon to offer support. Yet even these relationships were strained under the weight of scandal. Loneliness, once a private battle, became an unavoidable public narrative. Meanwhile, critics were relentless. Columnists, biographers, and royal historians re-examined her life, highlighting past controversies, rumored manipulations, and moments when her actions may have conflicted with public expectations. Television specials recounted Diana's charitable legacy in detail, each story serving as an implicit contrast to Camilla's alleged callousness. Public forums erupted with debates over morality, accountability, and the role of monarchy in a modern era. Legal ramifications also began to surface. Some lawyers suggested that Camilla's words could be interpreted as defamatory or as evidence of moral negligence, potentially exposing her to lawsuits or parliamentary scrutiny. Advisors warned that the combination of legal, financial, and reputational risk created an unprecedented crisis, one that could define her legacy permanently. Even international audiences weighed in. European media revisited past royal dramas, comparing Camilla to historical consorts embroiled in scandal. American outlets framed the story as a Shakespearean drama of ambition and betrayal. Social media users worldwide debated her motives, her character, and her place in history, ensuring that no corner of the globe remained untouched by the fallout. The diary's ongoing revelations only compounded her predicament. More pages leaked, each one more explicit than the last. Allegations of foreknowledge, strategic maneuvering, and possible complicity in Diana's fate painted a picture that was increasingly difficult to defend. Palace insiders warned that the damage was cumulative. Each new leak intensified public outrage and reduced the likelihood of rehabilitation. Camilla's silence in public, while intended as a strategic move, also fueled speculation. Some interpreted it as guilt. Others saw it as defiance. Every pause, every private appearance, every careful statement was scrutinized for hidden meaning. The public's imagination filled in the gaps, often assuming the worst. By the end of the first week of public fallout, Camilla's image had been irreversibly altered. Where once she had been cautiously accepted, she was now widely vilified. Polls suggested plummeting public approval. Social commentators predicted lasting damage to her reputation, perhaps permanent exile from public sympathy. And amidst this whirlwind, Charles's divorce decision loomed even larger, framing her not just as a figure of scandal, but as a catalyst for the monarchy's most severe crisis in decades. Yet even in this maelstrom, insiders hinted at a plan. Camilla reportedly considered a strategic response.